Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My guest today is Mr. Mike Nelson, who's a former Green Beret, and he has been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. And this is indeed what we'll be talking about today with Mike. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, what his roles were, and how he interacted with other American agencies and with the people on the ground and the populations of these two countries. Thanks for your time, Mike. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you.
Well, you're a former Green Beret, and that's why you have a very unique angle to give us about these two wars. But before we get into the details of what you've experienced, would you like to tell us something about yourself, who you are, something about your background, whatever you feel that is useful before starting with this interview?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, I spent most of my career in the United States Army, and most of that in the Army Special Forces. I joke that I went into the family business. My dad was in the Army for my whole childhood. So I had been exposed to the Army from a very early age. And at that time, that was during the Cold War. So I grew up for 8 years in Europe and 3 different assignments that my dad did over there. I grew up kind of hearing his stories about service in the military, his and my grandfather's. My grandfather was a Marine in Korea. I saw the world. I saw how the U.S. interacted with the world to a certain extent. I saw the aftermath of the during and the aftermath of the Cold War. And that kind of helped shape some of my thinking from a very early age, and basically solidified by the time I was in high school that I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to go into the military, and specifically the Army, and serve in a similar way to what my dad did. So I went to the Virginia Military Institute, right about 3 hours down the road from where I am now. And as soon as I graduated, I was commissioned into the Army as an artilleryman in the 82nd Airborne Division. I spent my first several years of my Army career there, at then Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, and including a deployment to Kosovo in early 2001, just before September 11th, and then the invasion of Iraq and subsequent first year of the U.S. Army being in Iraq. Upon coming back from Iraq, I went to the Special Forces qualification course, finished that up. That was about 1.5 years. Continued on to 5th Special Forces Group and a series of other Special Operations Forces assignments at various headquarters and organizations, and deployed to Iraq another 4 times after the initial invasion, so 5 total, 2 to Afghanistan, and a couple of other countries. I ended up coming back here to the DC area for my final assignment in 2019, and retired from the Army in 2022, and then have been living the think tank post-Army retirement life since then.
That's great and very interesting. So let's get to the details. Most of the time, regarding the facts that we're going to discuss today, you've been with the Green Berets. So first off, would you like to tell us who the Green Berets are? Because I think there's a lot of confusion. Because to the general public, Green Berets are only known for the movie with John Wayne, and people tend to mess up things and to mistake the Green Berets for somebody else. So would you like to introduce the Green Berets to us?
First of all, there's nothing wrong with the movie. I grew up watching it. I love that movie. It's kind of corny, but that introduction at the beginning where they show what the ODA was capable of, at the very beginning when they're doing the show for the journalists, that actually still is instructive for what the base element of Army Special Forces is. Now, you're right. There is a lot of confusion. The name alone, Green Berets versus Special Forces, causes confusion. A lot of people think Special Forces in the U.S. sense, meaning everything. SEALs, Rangers, Air Force Pararescue Jumpers, Marine Raiders, Army Rangers. In fact, that's a big umbrella of what we call Special Operations Forces. That's everything under Special Operations Command. Special Forces actually means Army Green Berets, but we tend to be colloquially called Green Berets. Everybody knows that because of the headgear that we wear that President John F. Kennedy gave us back in the 60s. Special Forces were created, Green Berets were created to do primarily a very unique mission. And each of the Special Operations Forces are actually designed to do kind of a tailored, unique mission. And that as the wars have gone on, each of those units has kind of modified what they've done to meet the requirements of the conflict at the time, but they've never lost their capability to do the thing they're primarily designed to do. In our case, we were designed to do what's called unconventional warfare, which is working by, with, and through an indigenous resistance organization to either coerce, overthrow, or disrupt a hostile power or occupying force. So think about, I don't know when this will air, but for reality timeline's sake, yesterday was the anniversary of D-Day. Yeah. And leading up to that, in the 1940s, the US had an organization called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, equivalent to the British Strategic Operations Executive, the SOE. And what they did leading up to D-Day was infiltrate primarily three-man, what they call Jedburgh teams, to pair up with the French resistance and prepare sabotage and resistance activities prior to the invasion on D-Day. So basically to disrupt the Germans on their own controlled turf by using indigenous resistance forces in support of a larger conventional operation. Now, that was pre-special forces. We were playing catch up. We were learning from a lot of our allies about some of the capabilities they'd built in World War II. So in 1952, the US Army decided we need this capability on an enduring basis. We might need to do this kind of stuff against the Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe. Excuse me. So in 1952, Army Special Forces Regiment was created from the roots of what the OSS did, tracing their lineage to a separate force called the 1st Special Service Force, but becoming what we know as modern Special Forces in 1952. And we were recruited at the time largely through something called the Lodge Act. They found a way, they basically built a pipeline for Eastern European immigrants who were coming to the States to come to the States, be able to enlist in the Army and get trained as special forces, so that if we did need to partner with Hungarian resistance forces, we had a native Hungarian speaker who was jumping back in and knew the people, knew the culture, knew the language to go back in. So a lot of the early days of special forces were recruited from people who had come from the countries that we thought we might have to do unconventional warfare in. Now, unconventional warfare is a very high-risk operation. During World War II, 50% of the OSS and SOE pilot teams that went in to partner with the French resistance were either killed or captured by the Germans. And that was at a very, low sophistication in terms of technical surveillance. So it is a very high-risk endeavor. And that's why it has, in some of the more exquisite forms, it's actually been attempted very few times, but we exist to provide that capability if required. And we have done it on a couple of occasions when we've been called on to deliver it, we've delivered it pretty well. Specifically in 2001, Task Force Dagger, which was based out of my old unit, the 5th Special Forces Group, partnered with the Northern Alliance to create a joint force of indigenous resistance to the Taliban, the Northern Alliance, combined with the capabilities that we brought to bear, integration of combined arms and airstrikes and things like that, to basically overtake Afghanistan within a series of months. Then again, in Operation Inherent Resolve, in the campaign against ISIS, ISIS had created a de facto state, a physical caliphate where they controlled the political and military environment of northern Syria and northern Iraq. So we partnered, Special Forces partnered with the Syrian Democratic Forces on the Syrian side of the border to basically present a resistance and eventual rollback of ISIS control on the Syrian side. On the Iraqi side, Special Operations Forces partnered with the Iraqi government forces, particularly Iraqi Special Operations Forces. So that was not UW, but on the Syrian side it was. So this is the capability that we are primarily designed to provide, working with resistance forces to, like I said, coerce, overthrow, disrupt hostile power or occupying force. We also, because we're trained in studying guerrilla warfare and being able to provide the guerrilla side of guerrilla warfare, we also tend to be very good at the other side, foreign internal defense, helping partners defeat insurgent or movements, targeting those networks. And that's what we did primarily in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Once the Taliban was toppled, once Saddam was out of power, and we had gone from supporting the counter state to the state and helping to establish a network that could then defeat the insurgent network of either Sunni extremists in Iraq or Taliban and later ISIS-K / al-qaeda elements in Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, Green Berets are primarily focused on working with indigenous forces, be they resistance or government, learning the languages and being regionally focused so that they can partner with those forces. So we have 5 active duty groups: 1st, 3rd, 5th, 7th, 10th. Each one has a different region. I came from 5th Special Forces Group, which is primarily focused on the Middle East. That means almost everyone in 5th Group speaks either Arabic or Farsi. I was trained in Farsi, so that if we ever needed to partner with local, Persian resistance to the Iranian regime, we would have people who had that capability. Same thing with the Arabic speakers, same thing with the Spanish speakers in 7th Group, the French speakers, and I think some Swahili speakers in 3rd Group. In 10th Group, they have a smattering of European languages, and then in 1st Group, they've got a real difficult problem with all the Pacific languages that they have to manage. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what we do.
Well, thank you. That was the introduction that we needed before we go to the other topics. So let's start with Iraq. I remember the first months of 2003 being hectic because there were a big controversy and a lot of discussions. Are they invading? Aren't they? And we always get and hear the opinions of politicians, but we hardly hear the thoughts of the people who were actually going there. So in the first months of 2003, when the invasion of Iraq started, what was the general feeling among you guys?
Okay, so there are a couple different things that we need to put into perspective. Transporting back in time 21 years, I'm less mature, I have less of a, holistic view of what I'm doing, I guess. One of the things, and I'm not proud of this, but we have to be honest about it. So in 2002, September 11th happened, excuse me, and I was in the 82nd Airborne at the time, specifically 2nd Brigade, and we watched as 3rd Brigade 82nd and 1st Brigade 82nd went off to Afghanistan, and the 2 Special Forces groups that at the time were on Fort Bragg went to Afghanistan, and all the 18th Airborne Corps units were sending parts to Afghanistan, and 2nd Brigade 82nd was sitting out the war. And we felt like we were missing the fight, right? Our country had been attacked, and we were sitting idle, just doing training, getting ready for what? We didn't know. So when we got the call in late 2002 to go to Kuwait and prepare for the invasion, we were all pretty excited because we had been feeling like we were missing out on our role as soldiers. Like we had been, there was a calling, our nation was at war, and we were supposed to be fighting the war. So there was a certain amount of what I'll call immature excitement to finally get into the fight. Next, when we were in Kuwait, it was all very serious. We were taking the planning for the event very seriously. We specifically deployed to a compound outside of Kuwait City International Airport. We were using that airstrip as our base. And we were primarily there to, in conjunction with elements from Ranger Regiment, seize what is now Baghdad International Airport. We were going to do a parachute jump to seize the airfield in the heart of Baghdad, southwest corner of Baghdad. But then that would allow follow-on forces to flow in once we controlled the airport, that we could bring them in via airland to have a more direct route into the heart of the regime. So we went into planning, we took it very seriously. We were less probably at that point in time focused on the debate about the WMDs. We definitely believed it was true. We invaded, when we did invade, and I'll get a little bit to how the plan changed, we were in mop suits, we were sweating it out in the Iraqi spring in our protective chemical suits. We believed that there was a red line, that when we got close to Baghdad, we were going to get hit with chemical weapons, that it was just only a matter of time. And we were going to need to be ready. We were drilling, we would do constant drills where we would mask up and sit in MOP 4, which is the most protective level, just to be ready to react like that while we were getting ready in Kuwait. So we believed that, Saddam was evil, which is true, that's without doubt, that he represented a threat to his neighbors and his domestic population, that we were tied down doing northern-southern watch, to protect the Kurds and the Marsh Arabs that had dealt with the aftermath of the 91 war. And we believed that he had a weapons of mass destruction program and that we were going to help find it. So the mood in Kuwait as we were getting ready to invade was very much, we were excited to go, right? It was a virtuous cause, and we were excited to prove our worth as soldiers, so to speak. and particularly because we thought we were going to do a combat jump, which was the bread and butter of the 82nd. That's what we thought we were going to do. As the invasion started and 3rd Infantry Division rolled across the border towards Baghdad, we started getting impatient. What's going to happen? Are we going or not? And what we noticed was the airfield on Baghdad eventually became cratered, became damaged to the point that we couldn't use it for airland to follow on forces, which was the whole reason we would have done the combat jump. So our mission was scrapped. The whole reason we went there, or we thought, was scrapped. But what did happen was, as 3rd Infantry Division was barreling towards Baghdad, they had a specific mission to get to the center of gravity, to get to Baghdad as quickly as possible. And that meant they weren't necessarily clearing out the towns along Highway 8 as they continued their march north. And what that did, we saw with the Jessica Lynch incidents, there were these elements of Fedayeen resistance left behind that were able to harry the lines of communication behind 3rd Infantry Division. So mission comes to 2nd Brigade 82nd. You're going to go, starting in a town called Asamawa, up Highway 8 and clear out all these towns behind 3rd Infantry Division. They're gonna do the major blue arrow in the desert to Baghdad, fighting the Republican Guard. We're going to clean out the urban population centers behind them, doing the urban fight. So in late March, we crossed the border via ground convoy up to Talil Airfield, right across from the Ziggurat of War. Staged there for a day, and then the next day, the brigade starts the fight in Asamawa to clear that out. So we do that for a series of days. That was where most of our significant resistance was. We push across the Euphrates River on the final day of the fight, clear out Asamawa, continue north, all the way through a series of smaller towns until we get to Diwania. And then we kind of stage there. We turn over, we're staged there for about a week, I think. Then we turn over that area to the Marines. We then head out to Anbar province, to the eastern portions of Anbar province, Hibaniya, Ramadi, Fallujah, and originally take the surrender of the Iraqi forces there. We're there for about 2 weeks. Some of our elements in Fallujah have a dust up between some protesters that end up firing on one of our companies. The company returns fire. It becomes the first kind of inciting event between Americans and the population of Fallujah that kind of sets the tone for how things are going to go. And then we turn that over to 3rd Infantry Regiment. I'm sorry, not 3rd Infantry Regiment, excuse me, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. And then we think we're going home, right? Because we were told we were there to do this airfield seizure. Then when the airfield seizure didn't happen, they needed us just to do this cleanup operation, but we're not going to occupy, right? That's somebody else's problem. We're going home, right? We had a quick war, 6 weeks, 3 months most, and then we're going home. That's what our division commander, General Swanek, told us. Well, we turn over everything in Ramadi, go to a compound in Iskandariyah for a night, thinking, nobody told us this, is just like, soldiers' rumors, that we're going to pack up everything, head south, and go home. And that's when we find out we're going to Baghdad. We're going to take over a portion of Baghdad from a brigade in the 101st, and we are going to be in for the long haul. Now, we don't know how long the long haul is. At the time, there's nothing longer than a 6-month deployment in the Army. The Balkans, both Bosnia and Kosovo, were 6 months. Afghanistan was still 6 months at the time. What had been called intrinsic action, which was an armored brigade in Kuwait, defending the Kuwaiti border, that had all been 6 months. So we're like, okay, worst case scenario, we're here for 6 months. But we get to Baghdad, and then it becomes kind of confusing, right? Paul Bremer has de-Baathified and released the Iraqi army from their employment. We are going to rebuild governance, but none of us know how to do that. None of us know how to do the functions of getting trash picked up or sewage pumped or the electricity turned back on or any of a number of things that cause frustration among the population who just wanted life to return to normal. And we'd removed the people who had provided any kind of normalcy, right? Because, yeah, the Ba'ath Party was full of some really evil people. It was also full of the electrical engineers who made the plants work. So we shifted very quickly into kind of an inept governance mode, right? We didn't know what we were doing. But we were focused on that. We hired a bunch of local security guards to try to prevent the looting. We started trying to contact local engineers to rebuild some of the capabilities that had gone missing. The CERP funds, the Commander's Extreme Relief Program, or whatever it was stood for, that money started flowing, so we could start kind of paying contractors to rebuild stuff. But about the summertime, as we're kind of wondering how long we're going to be there, what the end state of what we're trying to build is, that's when we start seeing convoys getting blown up, either RPG strikes or IEDs. And it's the first time we realize, like, this might not be as friendly a time in Iraq as we thought it was going to be after the initial fight. One thing that people do forget, like, people make fun of the "we're going to be greeted as liberators" statements.
Yeah.
We were greeted as liberators. Like, when we got to Baghdad, people were coming out, people like old Iraqi women were trying to marry their daughters off to soldiers at checkpoints. Would you consider marrying my daughter and bringing her back to America, right? And that wasn't just the Shias. It was, to a certain extent, some of the Sunnis in Baghdad who didn't necessarily see us as a bad thing. But eventually, number one, we had an unemployed, deluge of military-age males who'd just been in the Iraqi army and Iraqi police, and now were out of a job. We had their daily life had been disrupted in that we weren't providing regular services, and we couldn't tell them what was coming next in terms of governance. There was a fear among the Shias that they shouldn't necessarily stick their necks out because Saddam might come back. We hadn't found him yet. And then there was growing frustration that the reason we went to war looked like it wasn't legitimate because we weren't finding weapons of mass destruction. So as the summer started, there was growing discontent. We started getting IED'd more. We started getting mortared more. It was still pretty low-level sophistication. They were still feeling things out. The level of IED, the speed at which people were putting in IEDs later in the war, the sophistication in concealing them, the explosive yield of them, that hadn't really ramped up yet, but we were starting to see it in the summertime. And so about the late summer, in our brigade specifically, we switched brigade commanders. We got a new brigade commander named Kurt Fuller. And he decided, rightly, like, we're going to start targeting some of these networks that are targeting us. We still had some of the special operations elements that were still rounding up the old deck of cards, right? The old regime elements and high value targets. But we started in the summer to shift towards, okay, this is a domestic insurgency that we're going to have to face. And then we continued in that role, kind of half rebuilding, trying to establish local governance, half targeting the networks that were starting to build up the insurgency, and then reestablish security both through our efforts and through the creation of new Iraqi police and things like that. And that's where we went until I returned in about February of 2004. So I stayed there for the first year. I deployed to Kuwait in February of 2003. We invaded in March. I was in Iraq. I got to Baghdad, I think, very end of April, beginning of May. I was in Baghdad from May until February when I redeployed home. And I still believed at the time that the war was probably not going to be going on much longer, that was my turn in Iraq. And I knew I was going to the Q course. I'd already been to Special Forces selection. So the Q course was about 1.5 years. And I was like, okay, by the time I get back, the Battle of Fallujah, first Fallujah was kicking off about the time I was getting home, shortly after I was getting home. And so I was like, okay, this is going to come to a head and things are going to get dealt with before I get a chance to get back over there because my training pipeline is going to be so long.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. So long story short, this is a very long way so I guess it's not long story short. It's a very long answer to your question. The first year was a lot of confusion. And first year was a lot of misunderstanding about what we had really gotten ourselves into, what we thought we were there to do, how easy we thought that was going to be to do comparatively, and how some decisions, specifically those by Paul Bremer about debathification and releasing the Iraqi army, made what we actually needed to do much more difficult. Some real hasty decisions that were made in the aftermath of a very quick survey of the ground pretty hamstrung us for the rest of the time we were there.
What I wanted to ask you next is, you've been to different zones of Iraq as you just described us. And I think and correct me if I'm wrong, that there might be a striking difference from a zone to another for various reasons. First off, that Baghdad is in the center of Iraq, and you've been also further north. That means closer to Syria. That means closer to ISIS. But what I'm thinking of also is that these regimes don't actually control the nation as we can think of in either Italy or the United States, but they have a network of warlords, and each warlord is minding his own business. So was it different from Baghdad to other areas? What are the most striking aspects you would underline as difference between different zones?
Well, I think that there is a certain amount of truth that every place has regional uniquenesses, right? Like my grandparents came from Sicily, and I know that that's not the same as someone from Venice, right? Like it's a very different culture, a very different language even, right? Same thing in the United States, right? People from New York don't talk like people from Alabama, and they don't have the same concerns, and they don't have the same, dietary uniquenesses, right? Like we have different regions. So there is that truth that's universal. Now, what is true about Iraq? It's a little bit more unique. There are cultural hubs, like you've got a Kurdish extreme north, a Sunni north, a Shia south, and this east that can be mixed between Sunni, Shia, and even some parts of the Allah province, Kurd. As you pointed out, so over the course of 5 deployments, I was in different parts of the country. My initial one that I just talked about basically came up from Kuwait in that southern portion and then ended in Baghdad and stayed in Baghdad, got a little further west earlier, like I said, in Ramadi, in Anbar province, but largely Baghdad. My second deployment, I was in Taji, which is just north of Baghdad, but I was with the Special Operations or Special Forces Task Force, excuse me, focused in northern Iraq, so primarily the Sunni portions. And so dealing with the Sunni insurgencies of Tikrit, of Anbar province to a lesser extent, portions of it, of the Kurdish Sunni tensions in Kirkuk. Those were the problems we were looking at, and we had teams arrayed all throughout there. That was right when I graduated from the Q course. My battalion that I went to, 3rd Battalion, 5th Special Forces Group, was already deployed. They were already more than halfway through the deployment, so I joined them basically in progress. And that was a real eye-opener for me to see how different the war had been between when I left in February of 2004 and when I returned in November of 2005. So I was basically out of Iraq for 18 months. I came back. It was a very different fight, much more dangerous, much more risk on the roads, much more direct targeting of the networks. Our ODAs, Operational Detachment Alphas, that's the 12-man A team. We're getting into troops in contact much more frequently. Those are firefights. And that was 2005 into 2006 that I was there for that. Because of where I was at the battalion headquarters at the time. I had more of a holistic view. Like while I was in Taji, I was focused on what was going on throughout all of northern and western Iraq. So that was good education for me. I came back from that deployment and then moved over to become an ODA commander, the commander of ODA 586. At the time, Special Forces ODAs had 3 digits that designated what they were. They later shifted to 4 digits, but at the time I was ODA commander for 586. We did a training operation to Jordan for about 3 months where we trained up the Jordanian Special Operations Forces for their roles in some of the war in Iraq. And then in September, October 2007, I went back to Iraq, and this time I went to Bakuba, which is in Diyala province. And Diyala province is more about what you were getting at. It was a mixed Sunni Shia province. The Diyala River Valley, as you followed it out, each other village would be majority Sunni, majority Shia, but mixed. And then as you got further out towards Kanakin and Jalula, you started seeing Kurdish populations that had filtered down from the north. So Diyala was a much more complex situation, that you had these mixed populations and mixed militias that were working there. Now, to your point about local control and non-governmental control, what really changed in this deployment for me, this is when the Sons of Iraq were a thing. The Sons of Iraq, Concerned Local Citizens, they went through a couple different names. The Sawa, the Awakening. right? A lot of people attribute the success of 2007, 2008 to what they refer to as the surge, as though an influx of US forces doing security operations brought security to Iraq. I contend that an influx of US forces showed the United States was not deserting the war. We were serious about finding a peaceful resolution to the war and not deserting the Iraqis to slaughter each other. And we also enabled the Sons of Iraq, these de facto power brokers who already had control, some legal, some extra legal, some downright illegal. But we stopped resisting the environment and acknowledging that some of these local militias were already exerting control over portions of the country, and that we could work with them to prevent the really malign actors that we were worried about from exerting control there. So we basically flipped over a huge amount of people who had been working, or at least turning a blind eye or tacitly working with the insurgency, to then target the insurgency with us. So it was a huge coup on our part. And that's why by the end of 2008, we had largely brought the country towards a level of stability. And then by the time I went back for my fourth deployment in 2009, when I was in Tikrit, we didn't award any combat infantryman's badges in my battalion for any ODAs that trip. Like, the combat had really tapered off by 2009, which then led to what became Operation New Dawn and a pretty stable Iraq.
Well, you already said something about how you guys interacted with the population, and that actually you guys were more welcome than the impression that we had from the media. Did you guys also have to interact with leaders, meaning both the central government and local leaders? And how was the collaboration with them, if you had to?
I mean, I was able to enjoy particularly as an ODA commander, I was able to enjoy a certain amount of access to leaders. And some of it was the mystique of special forces, right? Like, I would meet with the equivalent leaders that an infantry battalion commander was meeting with, an Army lieutenant colonel, and me, flunky captain. I could walk in and have a meeting with the local police chiefs, the local district and regional government officials, and a lot of the Iraqi army. What I also was empowered to do through my chain of command was I could talk to these people that weren't necessarily the recognized power brokers, those militia leaders. Between me and there was another sister team that was working in Bakuba as well. We each had our contacts, and one of mine, he was a tribal leader, later, son of Iraq leader. He confessed to me he'd been a Republican Guard colonel in the '91 war, and then since 2003, he had been fighting American forces because his family and his tribe had been disenfranchised by us de-Ba'athifying and basically saying that they had no role in the future government. So he'd been fighting for Sunni interests. And when we did that conversion and brought him back into the fold, he was one of my best partners. And one of the reasons he was my best partner, or one of my best partners, is there was no concealment or guile. Like, he was open about the fact that he'd been fighting Americans, but now it was more important to his tribe to fight the recalcitrant insurgent elements. So we had, that mission in 2007, 2008 as a team leader was incredibly complex and rewarding, in that it was not just combat operations in the direct role, but it was also getting consensus from different parties in the Iraqi population, civic leaders, military, police leaders, political influencers, and like I said, those local tribal leaders, convincing them to do operations that I thought were important to both of us that they may not have been initially willing to do. So it was a really complex situation. There were a lot of entities within Diyala, in Bakuba and in Northwest Diyala, where I was working, that were playing multiple sides and had multiple interests and playing those off of each other. It was a great opportunity for a young Army captain with his 11 other Green Berets who were with him to be able to look at this complex situation and say, this is what we're trying to accomplish by the time we get out of here. We know we're not going to win the war, but this is where we can advance the cause over the next 8 months before we leave to pass off to the next team. So that was one of my two most rewarding deployments, I think, being an ODA commander.
While you were in Iraq, especially the later years, ISIS was starting to expand. Did you have to face that too?
So I told you that my team was in Bakuba in 2007. We went there because the Iraqi Special Operations Forces were creating a new regional commando battalion, the 8th Regional Commando Battalion out of Bakuba, that was going to be our primary partner. And so our mission shifted from what we thought it was going to be. Originally, we thought we were going back to the city where I had been in my second deployment, the city of Taji. So we did a lot of prep work looking at the environment in Taji, in and around Taji. And what we found is in Taji and Tarmiya, those portions north of Baghdad, there was this growing influence, not just from the traditional insurgents, from JRTN, from some al-qaeda foreign fighter elements, but there was also the growing transition to this organization called the Islamic State of Iraq. And at the time, we saw them as more of a nation threat. They were developing, they were building networks, but they were, an offshoot of some of the al-qaeda-like extremism, but it was Iraqi based. It was locally based. They weren't primarily foreign fighters, but we did see them as something that was starting to grow out of the aftermath. They, at least for my operations, they did not rise to the level of probably the top 3 threats while I was there. When I was in Diyala province, I was dealing with, on the Sunni side, primarily tribal, indigenous Sunni insurgent organizations that had made different alliances. I was dealing with an organization called JRTN, Jaish al-Riyal Tariq Naqshbandiya, also known as Naqshbandi. They were an emerging Sunni nationalist organization. And then on the Shia side, I was dealing with what was called JAM special groups, Jaish al-Mahdi special groups, who were the ones who did not acknowledge the ceasefire that Muqtada al-Sadr had declared against U.S. forces. So that was what I was primarily focused on. But I was aware that this organization was starting to creep up. My last deployment for Iraqi freedom ended in the summer of 2009. I came back from there. That's largely the environment that existed when I left there. But then, as I later was in Afghanistan, at this time I was in Afghanistan, I'm still paying attention to what's going on in Iraq. We see that the Maliki government is starting to seek retribution against a lot of the Sunni population. And so as the Sunnis feel targeted and persecuted, there starts to be sympathy towards some of these Sunni organizations. And there's the perfect storm between the Arab Spring, the Syrian civil war, the release of Sunni extremists from Syrian prisons that later fed into ISIS, and the merging of these Sunni nationalist elements between Iraq and Syria that basically just, imagine a fire that was deprived of oxygen, and all of a sudden now what had been ISI was flooded with all this oxygen, all these fighters, all this grievance against their 2 Shia governments. And all of a sudden ISIS comes roaring in 2013, 2014 with a vengeance. And no one was really paying attention. When I left Afghanistan in 2014 for the last time, for my last Afghan deployment, I ended up in an organization called Special Operations Command Central, at the time commanded by Mike Nagata. And this was the Special Operations headquarters underneath Central Command, working for then General Lloyd Austin, now the Secretary of Defense. And Mike Nagata was pretty much the only one in the military, or at least in CENTCOM, banging the drum saying, this ISIS problem is coming and it's bigger than we realize, and they are gaining in power and strength. And he was saying this all through 2013. And by 2014, as they were growing their influence in Anbar province and then up in towards Mosul, it was still largely ignored right up until the fall of Mosul. And that's when it became the undeniable problem, when all of a sudden America had to admit that our taking our eyes off the transition in Iraq had led to some pretty ill effects. A lot of those were political decisions to back Maliki. A lot of those were domestic political decisions to withdraw our stability forces and our influence among the Iraqi government, and basically just pretend everything was fine because we had achieved a level of stability. But we didn't pay attention to the smoldering fire that came back with a vengeance.
Well, let's get to Afghanistan, which is probably even more complex, at least from a population point of view. How was collaboration between the locals there, both the population and the leaders, I mean?
So my Afghan experience was a little different. I was primarily an Iraq guy, so to speak. By the time I got to Afghanistan for the first time in August of 2011, I got there shortly after a couple months after the killing of bin Laden. I got there almost just right after the extortion crash, which was the largest loss of special operations life in Afghanistan, and right before the 10-year anniversary of September 11th. And I remember, once again, going back to that kind of immature enthusiasm that I had in Iraq in 2003, I remember getting to Afghanistan and thinking, it's just about the 10-year mark. Thank God I made it here because this war is wrapping up. And I didn't want to miss out on being part of Afghanistan too. Little did I know that was like literally just the halfway mark, 10 years into a 20-year war. So my first trip over was with a special operations task force primarily focused on targeting high-value individuals. So I was working at the headquarters of this unit, looking at a kind of nationwide problem. There were forces out there doing these operations, and I was primarily one of the planners for their use of their partner force and how we were going to create their partner force to then hand off this capability of targeting high-value individuals to an Afghan counterterrorism force. So it was my first exposure to Afghanistan, but it was at a very high, what's the word I'm looking for, I guess, highly specific capability. So I was dealing with I was dealing with Afghan leaders, but at the national level and in their special operations forces. So these were guys, a lot of them had been mujahideen in the 80s. Then they had gone into the Northern Alliance. They'd been fighting for, 20, 30 years by the time I met these guys. And they were salty and experienced warriors who had transitioned into this latest role of being within this, what later became called KTEHAS, at the time was called Afghan Partnering Unit. And this was created to be one of the Afghan Special Operations Forces, but specifically one that was tailored to target high-value individuals. So the time I was there was a little unique. I got there, like I said, excuse me, in August of 2011. It was the tail end of what has been referred to as the Obama surge, which I talked about how I thought the Iraq surge, the real benefit was the political demonstration of will. Americans are committed to this. The Obama surge in Afghanistan was rolled out with his speech at West Point, and in that same speech he said, but by the way, we're withdrawing these surge forces at a set time. So I don't think it had the same residual effect of showing America was serious. What I do think it did was started the 10-year process of us constantly communicating, hey, we're just about out of here, right? And instead of saying, we're going to be here for another 10 years, so Taliban, you better get used to the idea of finding a political settlement, we basically communicated, we're looking for the door pretty much right around the corner. So what was the biggest topic when I was there was the drawdown from over 100,000 troops during the surge to 68,000 and planning for that. And specifically, my organization that I was working for at the time, because our numbers counted differently, because they were on a slightly different mission. They were on a counterterrorism mission, not the stability in Afghanistan mission. How does that organization create more effects to offset the withdrawal forces? But it was meant to be, like I said, the end of the Obama surge. It was meant to start the beginning of the end. So we were communicating to the Taliban, to the Afghan government, to individual commanders who may have made local peace with Taliban commanders, as we saw later in 2021, just so you know, we're not going to be here forever. And I think it made people constantly looking. It made it less likely that locals would permanently commit to risking themselves for a US-based coalition that was communicating a lack of seriousness or a lack of commitment. Which is, like I said, which is ironic because we ended up committing for another 10 years. We just were communicating a lack of commitment. So that was a large part of the how do we off-ramp some of these capabilities to our Afghan partners? How do we find what good enough is for a US withdrawal? I think we made a huge mistake from the outset in that we tried to create an Afghan military and an Afghan government that looked too much like us. Now, like the Afghan governance structure was formed differently, but it was still meant to be a central government that had strong control of the whole country. And they were never going to be that. Afghanistan, when it's been most stable, it's been something that looks a lot like feudalism. There's local control of villages and districts and regions and provinces. And there's someone in Kabul who's nominally in charge, and he lays out what his non-negotiables are, and people kick up tribute upstairs to him, but generally he doesn't interfere too much in what's going on in Kandahar. And I think we looked at a very Western liberal approach to Afghanistan and said, victory is little girls in school, which is inherently a good thing. But rather than using that as a metric of success, we should have used stability and acceptability to the local population as a metric for success. And then we can do all those social reforms the same way we did. I mean, Japan was an impenetrable culture. But we focused primarily on reforming Japan to be not a threat to its neighbors. And then through interaction with the West, they've become a valuable partner.
Well, in Afghanistan, you have also been with the JSOC that, correct me if I'm wrong, if I get it correctly, is a sort of joint effort between different agencies tasked with special operations. And so we did discuss how your collaboration with locals was, but how was collaboration between different agencies within the JSOC?
So the war, I mean, there's been a lot made out in the lead up to September 11th about how US was stovepiped in a lot of our agencies. The FBI knew some things, the CIA knew other things, they weren't sharing with each other, there was no collaboration, there was no fusion. It was siloed and inefficient. I think the war created an impetus to break down a lot of these boundaries, and particularly in what we saw, like when General McChrystal took over JSOC and made it flat and fast. That included inclusion from the external partners who may not be inherent to JSOC. So I do think that they're like the creation of interagency task forces. Those became the norm more than the exception, right? The idea that there would be liaison, exchange liaison officers, open communication about things, the use of each other's capabilities towards a positive end, that became more the norm. And that worked out really well for my final deployment in Baghdad. In 2016-17, I ran an organization called the Baghdad Targeting Cell. I'm not trying to divert back to Iraq, but I'm just pointing out this is an example of some of the interagency cooperation. So this organization was a trilateral US, UK, Australian organization in response to ISIS targeting Baghdad to try to create pressure on Baghdad as the fight in Mosul was starting. They wanted to pressure the Baghdad by killing civilians in Baghdad. They wanted to force the government to withdraw forces from Mosul to secure the capital, to take pressure off the ISIS fighters there. That was their plan. So there were a series of car bombs and suicide bombings that took place. And my mandate was to target the networks that were threatening these attacks. I had no collection capabilities of my own, and I had no delivery capabilities of my own. But what I did have was liaison and coordination between the multiple intelligence agencies with multiple capabilities and specialties of the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the Iraqi government. creating a joint intelligence picture, and then disseminating that to either the Iraqi Special Operations Forces to action the target, to a drone strike that was controlled by the Special Operations Task Force West, to any number of things. So that spirit of collaboration that was born after September 11th has become, I think, more the norm and more the expectation of sharing intelligence, sharing capabilities. It was when I was over in Bagram with a Special Operations Task Force, there were heavy-hitting interagency representatives from all of them there, and there was no expectation that anyone was going to deny or hold back anything. Everything was available to everyone. And one of the projects I did work on while I was there was the recovery of Bo Bergdahl. And as you can imagine, so Bo Bergdahl was the American soldier who wandered off his compound for a lot of different explanations as to what he was thinking or why he did it. But he ended up being captured by the Haqqani network and held in captivity for a series of years. And the commander I worked for at the time, I thought this was an incredibly admirable thing. There were a lot of people who thought Bo Bergdahl was a traitor, or he was a coward, or he sold out his country, or whatever it was. And this commander said, it's not up to us to determine who's worthy of rescue. Our job is to rescue Americans. So we're going to find him. And it was a multi-year effort. It started with him. I mean, other efforts had started, but within this organization, he said, we're going to bring together the capabilities. So one of my jobs was building the capabilities that would go into a fusion center, an interagency center that would find and develop options to recover Bo Bergdahl. So not only was interagency cooperation kind of writ large for the big mission more normal, but also tailoring it for these specific tasks became the norm.
Well, you mentioned a lot of actors that you had to face in Afghanistan, and I would like to ask you, which was your worst threat? Because in Afghanistan, you guys had the Taliban, you had al-qaeda, you had ISIS-K, and as you just mentioned, the Haqqani network. Who was the worst of them, or maybe a combination, an alliance of them? What would you say?
So I'm going to have to answer that in two different ways, because between what I saw nationwide, or what I understood nationwide, and then what I personally encountered, so to speak. So my first deployment, like I said, it was kind of a nationwide approach. Haqqani has always been, I think, the number one. They were the one branch. They've always been this like semi-autonomous part of the Taliban. They were part of the Taliban, but they were their own thing.
Yeah.
They were very regimented and structured. They were more professionalized, more organized than the rest of the Taliban. They were less of a loose confederation than the rest of the Taliban. Number one, Haqqani has never distanced themselves from al-qaeda. From September 12th on, they said, we are never going to apologize for our links to al-qaeda. They're our friends, and forget you if you want us to distance ourselves from them. So that was always part of the negotiation that the Trump and Biden administrations undertook with the Doha dialogues that never went anywhere, because that was one of our conditions. You have to basically deny access to al-qaeda in Afghanistan, and Haqqani as a seat at the table, with Siraj Haqqani being number 2 in the Taliban saying no. And then we ended up just saying, okay, fine, that's fine. We're looking for the doors anyway, so we don't care. So Haqqani, number one, more extreme, more organized, more willing to conduct targeted attacks against the Afghan population. And what I found was, when you killed a mid-level Haqqani commander, even somebody you'd been going after for a while, right? Like, this is a great victory. We finally killed objective whatever. That guy was replaced within 48 hours, because they were such a militarized, organized, just like we are. If a company commander gets killed, we know that person's executive officer, the number 2 in command in the company, is able to step up and become the company commander. Haqqani was like that. It was pretty well established what their networks were. So it was hard to have lasting effects against Haqqani by targeted HVI strikes or targeted HVI captures, right? They were much more of a professionalized organization. By the time I went back in 2014, I was a special forces company commander at the time. And the number one key task from the Special Operations Joint Task Force commander, who later became the final commander in Afghanistan at all. Excuse me. The final, or the number one key task to him, to all of his forces, was kill or shaping operations to kill Haqqani. That was his number one priority. He saw that as the number one threat. So I do think that Haqqani represented the biggest obstacle we had to progress throughout the duration of the war. Now, me personally, when I was a company commander in 2014 for what we call an AOB, a Special Forces, that's a Special Forces line company. My partner was the 5th Special Operations Kandak, basically Afghan commandos. And we did not have Haqqani. They were not native to the north, primarily. So I had the 9 northern provinces of Afghanistan, from Badakhshan, which is that little tail that touches China, all the way out to the Iranian border. 9 northern provinces, that's where I was responsible, which is pretty big for one company to try to deal with. But this was a withdrawal. We were ending combat operations, we were withdrawing, we were retrograding. So my primary threat were northern indigenous Taliban networks that also cooperated with the IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. They would infiltrate into Takhar province and then over into Kunduz province. That was my primary focus. So I was in Balkh province in Mazar-e-Sharif, but my primary focus, where I saw the threat coming, not only it was threatening the lines of communication between Kabul and the north, it was trying to threaten the resupply routes, and it was also trying to establish local control over the population, was in Kunduz province, just to the east. And specifically, it came out of this northeastern district called Dashti-Archi. So I had the challenge of 2014, we had retrograded down our medevac and resupply and everything to a tiny little bubble over Mazar-e-Sharif. I was not allowed to leave that bubble. I was under guidance that my soldiers couldn't go outside of a ring that guaranteed or near guaranteed that they could be in surgery in an hour if they had to be. Right? The golden hour became, from a good guideline for life-saving procedures, it became a shackle. It became, we are so risk averse that we're not going to let anybody go outside the golden hour. So my problem that I faced in 2014 was, how do I conduct combat operations against these northern-based Taliban indigenous forces and IMU actors that is outside my golden hour ring? So what I had to do was, on 3 occasions, we built an expeditionary package of surgical capability, air assets, refueling capabilities, resupply, picked it up, moved it over to an airfield in Kunduz that had been shut down for a few years, surprised the Taliban with our access there, and did nightly raids all over Kunduz province, and then shut it down, went back, refit, and then a couple of weeks later, we'd go back and do it again. So, long way of answering that, Haqqani overwhelmingly the big threat in Afghanistan. And then, from my experience, it was these northern Taliban with IMU actors that I was fighting. Now, one little postscript caveat, ISIS-K didn't really exist when I was an AOB. They weren't a viable presence. They became later. Remember, ISIS had pledged fealty to al-qaeda early on, and it wasn't until I'm trying to remember when it was that I think it was 2013 that they divorced and started branching out and doing their own thing.
I would say so, probably 14, but more or less.
Yeah. And then ISIS, as it built its separate branches out. So one of the things that really bugs me is just a pedantic measure is ISIS is, Islamic State of Iraq and the Sham, the Levant. So it drives me crazy that we use the terms Islamic State in Iraq and the Sham in the Khorasan, right? Yeah, it should be Islamic State of the Khorasan. So, but either way, that they didn't really start building capability until later. And what we did see is they are the more violent and extremist actors than even al-qaeda and the Taliban, right? We saw this with Abbey Gate. We've seen this with subsequent attacks where The Taliban really thinks these guys are a pain in the neck because they are so willing to kill civilians. And they are the true, like, you know, apocalyptic cult, so to speak, that we saw the rest of ISIS being. So they do represent a major problem for the future stability of Afghanistan now. And now Taliban have inherited the nightmare that we were dealing with. Like, now you have to provide stability against these malign actors, in addition to being, you know, pretty evil actors themselves. But ISIS-K is too extreme for even them.
Well, let me ask you the question that everybody is waiting for. How come the resistance to the Taliban collapsed like that within days? Because we were expecting, when the Americans left, that the Afghan government put in place by the Americans had some stability, but that actually faded, melted within days. What happened? Why?
Well, I mean, there's a political and a military question to that. And there's an external question about America's role in this. So, political question, Ashraf Ghani was never a good leader. Ashraf Ghani was never focused on the right things and making the right decisions that for the years he was in power, to try to bring about stability and empower those leaders who might create stability at the local level. The military question, so one of the things that really aggravates me is when Westerners and primarily Americans say things like that the Afghans were cowards, or the Iraqi partners were cowards, or they didn't stand up and do their own fighting, right? The Afghan security forces were taking casualties hand over fist in the years leading up to the withdrawal and the collapse. They were sucking down casualties at a rate that the United States, like in 2 years, I may be slightly wrong on this, in 2 years, Afghan security forces took as many casualties as the United States took in the entirety of Vietnam, right? So the idea that the Afghan security forces were not trying to fight the Taliban is ridiculous. We did, however, hamstring them by, instead of building a force from the beginning, from the early 2000s, instead of building a force that had the capability to fight the war they needed to fight with the mechanisms and in the structures that they're used to fighting, we said, nope, you need to look kind of like the American Army. You need to depend on American logistics. You need to depend on American capabilities and systems that you can't maintain or get supply parts for or move throughout the country without this system that we did. And as we built that, we recognized there were problems with the Afghan army delivering the support to this organization that we were building them to be. And instead of saying, let's work through how you deliver your own logistics, let's work through how you do this, we said, we got it. We're going to fly the logistics around the country for you, because we were impatient. We looked at, we need success against the Taliban so we can leave, as opposed to, let's focus on building the actual capabilities within our partners. And in so much as we did focus on building those capabilities, it was largely combat operations. It was infantry tasks. It was artillery tasks, which is important, but it was not the things that make those infantry units run, like resupplying them, like managing, maintaining, and forecasting a logistics and resupply network and a maintenance network for the helicopters that we told them they needed, the Blackhawks that they couldn't get resupply parts for when they broke, right? So we hamstrung them with an American-like system that made sense to us rather than a system that made sense to them. And so by the time, in addition to building it inefficient or building it incorrectly, because we built it to look like us, then lacking patience with their ability to catch up and provide those things, so we just did it for them. And that included, by the way, when those infantry units would get into troops in contact, we'd say, here comes the cavalry, American air. So they never got used to fighting out of the problem. They got used to the way you fight is calling American air to come and drop bombs on the Taliban. Well, what happens when you withdraw that capability? Then you've got a Taliban who still has the same capabilities they've always had, fighting against an Afghan force whose primary course of action to contact is no longer available. So as we withdrew, individual commanders started making individual separate pieces. And I'm not calling these guys cowards, but when you have the choice of, I, with my Kandak of Afghan soldiers who are out here in the hinterlands, have not received ammunition resupply for weeks and don't know if I will again, I can valiantly say, no, Taliban, I stand up against you, and be slaughtered valiantly. Or I can say, I know what the writing on the wall is. I'm going to make a separate peace to let my soldiers go home, and hopefully we return to civilian lives. Now, what we've seen, unfortunately, is a lot of the Afghan security forces, particularly the Special Operations Forces and the NDS, have been hunted down and executed, tortured, right? The Taliban is seeking retribution against them. One last thing that I think it's important for us to focus on is the United States was so focused on finding a withdrawal from Afghanistan that under two administrations, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, started by Khalilzad, right? I mean, he was the one who was given and I don't think he's an evil actor. I just think he was so focused on finding an agreement with the Taliban that we cut our GROA, Government of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, partners out of what the negotiating process was. We made separate deals that they would end up having to agree to or live with, not even agree to, without talking to them. We agreed to certain things with the Taliban that were non-negotiables to the government of Afghanistan and should have been non-negotiables to us. But it was just, we showed our desperation to get a deal so much that we gave the Taliban everything they wanted, extracted really nothing in return besides just don't hurt us on our way out. And so as the Taliban built up capability, as we withdrew capability from the Afghan army, as the Taliban was very clear when we were leaving and when they could start up their nefarious activities again, because we wouldn't be there to help our Afghan partners, we set up the conditions for this precipitous collapse.
Well, Mike, many thanks for your time and for your very special and precious explanations, because I think that you gave a very unique perspective on these things we discussed, because I think that a lot of things that you said were totally unexpected, because these last things that you just described us about agreements in Qatar, in Doha, are very little known. And also what you said about the role of the Haqqani network, for instance, is very little known. These are things that are usually not debated in the news or in documentaries. So I think that this account that you just gave us is very precious. Therefore, I really thank you for being part of this episode today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about this. This was my life's work. It's what I remain proud of everything I did, even if it didn't work out the way we hoped it would. But I'm proud of those that I served with. I'm proud of those that I served alongside in the Iraqi and Afghan militaries. You can't, sorry, my directions are a little, you can't see it right now because there's this chair in the way, but framed right there, that is the patches of the Afghan Special Operations Commandos and Iraqi Special Operations Forces. Those were my partners. That
the bottom one, the third one?
The bottom one, the one that's unfortunately covered by the chair. I should have thought that through. But you know, that's there to remind me, like, these were, you know, we didn't necessarily have the same interests, but we had a commonality of purpose in who we were trying to defeat and who we fought alongside. So you know, like I said, it's always a great opportunity to talk about what I did, what my brothers in arms did, and what our partners that, in the case of Iraq, are still dealing with it, and in the case of Afghanistan that we left behind, that are still dealing with the aftermath, what they did, and that they didn't, you know, stop fighting.
Thanks again for your time, Mike, and thanks everybody else for watching this. So see you all next time. Bye-bye.